The quickest way to reveal someone's character is to assume you already know it. The dinner rush had transformed Le Chateau Manhattan into a sea of crystal reflections, quiet conversations, and the gentle sound of polished silver against fine porcelain. Beneath towering chandeliers, diplomats, executives, and international investors filled nearly every table, while a string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Among the perfectly choreographed movements of the restaurant staff, Claire Whitmore carried herself with calm precision. At 27, the blonde waitress moved through the elegant dining room with effortless grace, her crisp white shirt, tailored black vest, neatly tied black apron, and polished black shoes blending into the luxurious surroundings as though she had always belonged there. She remembered every returning guest's favorite drink, noticed empty glasses before anyone asked for a refill, and somehow made every customer feel as though they were the only person in the room. Most people saw only another waitress. Claire had learned long ago that people rarely looked beyond the uniform. That evening, a private dining table near the center of the restaurant attracted everyone's attention. Ethan Caldwell, the 40-year-old billionaire founder of Caldwell International, had reserved the entire section for an important dinner with a French investment group considering a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan's reputation traveled ahead of him wherever he went. Brilliant, demanding, exceptionally successful. He spoke multiple languages fluently and quietly enjoyed surprising people with abilities they never expected. Sometimes those surprises became lessons. Other times they became tests. As Claire approached the table carrying a silver tray with sparkling water and handcrafted menus, Ethan barely looked up from his conversation. The French investors greeted him warmly before discussing market forecasts in rapid French. Claire placed each glass carefully, her movements calm and silent. Ethan noticed her only long enough to assume she would understand nothing being said. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Switching completely into fluent French, he spoke just loudly enough for the guests beside him to hear. Our waitress looks pleasant enough, but I doubt she understands a single word. Fortunately, beautiful restaurants do not require multilingual servers. Several of the French guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One gentleman shifted slightly in his chair, clearly recognizing that the comment was unnecessary. Another forced an awkward smile before quietly changing the subject. Claire continued pouring sparkling water with steady hands, showing no visible reaction. Ethan interpreted her silence exactly as he expected. She had not understood him. Satisfied, he leaned back confidently and continued discussing business in flawless French while occasionally allowing another subtle joke to slip into the conversation at the waitress's expense. Claire finished placing the final glass before gently collecting her serving tray. She thanked the guests in perfect English with her usual warm professionalism. Then, just before turning toward the kitchen, she paused for the briefest moment. Without changing her calm expression, she looked directly at Ethan and spoke in elegant, effortless French, her Parisian accent so natural that every conversation at the table stopped instantly. Monsieur Caldwell, your guests deserve to enjoy dinner without unnecessary embarrassment. I hope the next language you choose tonight is respect. The crystal room fell completely silent. One investor slowly lowered his wine glass. Another stared at Claire with open surprise before a genuine smile spread across his face. Ethan remained frozen where he sat, every trace of confidence disappearing from his expression as he realized the woman he had dismissed had understood every single word from the very beginning. Claire offered a polite nod to the entire table, turned gracefully, and walked toward the kitchen without another glance behind her, leaving an entire room wondering who the quiet waitress truly was. Claire Whitmore disappeared behind the kitchen doors as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She hung the empty silver tray neatly on its rack, checked the next order ticket, and thanked the pastry chef for preparing a dessert ahead of schedule. Around her, the restaurant continued moving with its usual rhythm. Plates left the kitchen. Glasses were polished. Orders were called with practiced precision. Yet every employee who had witnessed the exchange in the dining room found themselves stealing quiet glances toward Claire. No one could understand how she remained so composed after speaking flawless French to one of the most influential businessmen in New York. Claire offered no explanation because she had never considered language something worth displaying. To her, it was simply another way of understanding people. A few minutes later, she returned to the dining room carrying another tray as naturally as if nothing had interrupted her evening. She greeted a young couple celebrating their engagement, remembered that an elderly guest preferred warm lemon water instead of iced water, and quietly replaced a child's spilled napkin before his parents even noticed. Every movement reflected years of careful attention rather than performance. Guests smiled because she remembered details no reservation system ever recorded. She noticed nervous first dates, anxious business meetings, lonely travelers, and tired parents before they spoke a single word. Languages had taught her vocabulary. Listening had taught her people. Across the dining room, Ethan Caldwell could no longer focus on the investment discussion unfolding before him. One of the French executives smiled politely before switching back into English. "Mr. Caldwell," he said with quiet amusement, "your waitress has an exceptional command of French. Parisian pronunciation, if I am not mistaken." Another investor nodded. Not only her pronunciation, her choice of words was elegant. She spoke with respect while correcting someone who did not offer her the same courtesy. Ethan forced a composed smile, though the unexpected embarrassment lingered beneath it. Apparently, I underestimated her. The oldest member of the French delegation looked toward Claire as she carefully poured coffee for another table. "The remarkable part was not that she speaks French," he said thoughtfully. "The remarkable part was that she waited until respect became more important than silence." Ethan followed the man's gaze. Claire laughed gently with an elderly woman celebrating her birthday before carefully adjusting the chair for her husband. Moments later, she congratulated a college graduate whose family had quietly mentioned the occasion while making the reservation. She never remained at any table longer than necessary, yet every guest looked happier after she walked away. Ethan began noticing details he had ignored only minutes earlier. She anticipated requests before customers voiced them. She moved through the crowded restaurant without ever appearing rushed. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Curiosity slowly replaced embarrassment. During a brief pause in the dinner service, Ethan discreetly asked the restaurant manager, "How long has Claire worked here?" "Almost 4 years," the manager answered. "She is one of our most trusted employees." Ethan glanced toward Claire again. "Did you know she speaks French?" The manager smiled with genuine surprise. "French? No. We knew she was exceptionally good with international guests, but she has never mentioned speaking another language." Ethan looked back toward the dining room, where Claire had already begun helping another table with effortless professionalism. The more he watched, the more one question refused to leave his mind. If a woman capable of speaking flawless French had chosen to spend 4 years quietly serving guests without ever revealing that ability, what else about Claire Whitmore had everyone, including him, completely failed to see? The investment dinner continued, but its rhythm had quietly changed. Conversations still flowed across the polished mahogany table. Expensive wine continued to fill crystal glasses, and the string quartet maintained the same elegant melody drifting through the dining room. Yet Ethan Caldwell found himself listening less to market projections and more to the calm voice of the waitress moving between tables several yards away. Every time Claire spoke with a guest, there was an ease in her words that could not be rehearsed. She never hurried anyone. She never interrupted. She simply listened first and answered second. The contrast unsettled him. Throughout his career, Ethan had built international companies by making quick judgments. He trusted first impressions because they had served him well in boardrooms across New York, London, Singapore, and Zurich. Tonight, however, one quiet sentence spoken in flawless French had exposed how easily confidence could become assumption. One of the French investors gently set down his fork before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, may I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." The gentleman smiled politely. "Did you know your waitress studied in France?" Ethan looked toward Claire before answering honestly. "I know almost nothing about her." "That surprises me," another guest replied. "Most people who learn French to that level have invested years of their lives." That was not classroom French. That was lived French. Ethan remained silent. The observation stayed with him long after the conversation moved back to business. When dessert arrived, Claire returned carrying delicate porcelain plates with practiced elegance. She placed each dessert before the guests with careful precision, describing every selection in clear English before quietly stepping away. Ethan noticed that she never attempted to draw attention to herself, even after what had happened earlier. She behaved exactly as she had before, revealing her remarkable fluency. Curiosity slowly replaced his embarrassment. As Claire passed nearby once again, Ethan spoke in a calm voice. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped beside the table with the same composed expression she had carried all evening. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." There was no resentment in her tone, no satisfaction, only professional courtesy. Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment before asking, "Where did you learn French?" Claire smiled gently, though not in a way that invited further conversation. "Many places teach languages, Mr. Caldwell. Life simply happened to be one of mine." Before Ethan could ask another question, one of the French investors laughed warmly. "That is a very French answer." The table shared a quiet smile. Claire inclined her head politely and excused herself to assist another guest requesting coffee. Ethan watched her disappear into the softly illuminated dining room once again. The oldest member of the delegation leaned toward him and spoke almost confidentially. "Do you know why her response impressed me more than her accent?" Ethan looked at him curiously. The gentleman folded his hands together. "Because she never used her knowledge to make you feel smaller than she was. She only used it to restore respect to the conversation." Those words settled heavily over the table. Ethan had met countless multilingual executives throughout his career. Most enjoyed demonstrating what they knew. Claire had done the opposite. She revealed only enough to protect her dignity, then quietly returned to serving others as though nothing extraordinary had happened. As the evening continued, Ethan realized he was no longer trying to understand how Claire spoke French so well. The question that refused to leave him had become something entirely different. Why would someone with abilities that remarkable choose to spend years quietly working in a restaurant without ever allowing anyone to discover who she truly was? The evening moved steadily toward its most important discussion as contracts, financial projections, and partnership details covered the polished mahogany table. The French delegation had traveled to New York to finalize an agreement that would expand Ethan Caldwell's company across several European markets. Every sentence carried weight, and every misunderstanding could cost millions of dollars. Claire continued serving the surrounding tables with quiet professionalism, never glancing toward Ethan's private dining section unless someone needed assistance. She seemed perfectly content allowing the moment to fade into memory. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior French executives carefully unfolded a revised agreement from his leather briefcase and pointed to a handwritten notation beside one of the partnership clauses. He frowned slightly before speaking to the group in rapid French. Ethan answered immediately, equally fluent, but after several exchanges the conversation became noticeably tense. Two members of the delegation quietly disagreed over the interpretation of a legal expression that could be understood differently depending on its cultural context rather than its literal translation. Ethan defended his interpretation with confidence, yet uncertainty slowly appeared on several faces around the table. The oldest executive finally removed his glasses and sighed. "This phrase carries historical meaning in French commercial law," he explained. Translated literally, it suggests one obligation. Understood culturally, it suggests another. Ethan read the sentence again. Although his French remained technically flawless, he realized the phrase reached beyond vocabulary into tradition. The room grew unusually quiet. At that exact moment, Claire approached with freshly brewed coffee requested several minutes earlier. She gently placed each cup before the guests without interrupting the discussion. As she reached the final place setting, the oldest executive looked up and smiled politely. "Mademoiselle," he asked in French, "would you mind sharing how you understand this expression?" Ethan looked up immediately, surprised by the request. Claire hesitated only briefly before lowering her eyes to the document resting on the table. She read the handwritten clause once, then smiled almost imperceptibly. If this contract were being negotiated in Paris, she replied in graceful French, "Your interpretation would certainly be correct. However, because this agreement involves both American and French partners, the wording could unintentionally create different legal expectations. In France, this phrase carries an element of mutual trust developed over generations of commercial custom. In American business culture, precision usually replaces tradition. I believe everyone at this table actually wants the same outcome. The sentence simply needs to express it more clearly." Silence filled the room once again, but this time it felt entirely different. One executive slowly nodded. Another smiled with obvious admiration. The oldest gentleman laughed warmly before turning toward Ethan. "Your waitress understands more than French," he said. "She understands France." Ethan looked at Claire in complete disbelief. She had not corrected anyone. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had quietly built a bridge between two cultures using nothing more than thoughtful words and genuine respect. Claire gently handed the document back to the executive. "I hope that is helpful," she said softly before excusing herself to assist another table. She walked away exactly as she always did, without waiting for praise or acknowledgement. Ethan remained seated with the contract open before him, realizing that every language he had spent years mastering suddenly felt incomplete. Vocabulary alone had never been enough. Somehow the quiet waitress who carried coffee through the dining room understood something far more valuable than grammar. She understood people first and language second. The dinner concluded with warm handshakes and genuine smiles. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell noticed that every member of the French delegation paused to thank Claire personally before leaving the restaurant. They spoke with her naturally, asking about favorite cafes in Paris, small villages in Provence, and regional expressions that rarely appeared in textbooks. Claire answered each question with effortless warmth, never trying to impress anyone. She spoke as though she were simply continuing a conversation with old friends. Ethan remained standing near the entrance, watching something he could no longer explain. Most people revealed their greatest strengths whenever they had an audience. Claire seemed determined to hide hers whenever possible. As the final guests disappeared into the cool Manhattan night, Ethan quietly approached the restaurant manager. "I would like to see Claire's employee file," he said. The manager looked mildly surprised. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell." Within a few minutes, a slim folder rested on Ethan's private table. He expected to discover degrees from prestigious universities, international consulting experience, or employment at luxury hotels across Europe. Instead, the file appeared remarkably ordinary. Claire Whitmore. For years at Le Chateau Manhattan. Outstanding guest satisfaction scores. Perfect attendance record. Several customer commendations praising her professionalism and kindness. No mention of French. No mention of international experience. No mention of anything that explained what he had witnessed only moments earlier. Ethan frowned. "Is this everything?" The manager nodded. "As far as we know." "Did no one ever ask where she learned French?" The manager smiled apologetically. "She never gave anyone a reason to ask. She only used English while working here." Ethan closed the folder slowly. That answer made even less sense than the file itself. Across the dining room, Claire quietly helped another server stack polished glasses before carefully wiping down an empty table. She behaved exactly as she had every other evening. There was no trace of pride in her expression. She had saved an important business discussion, earned the admiration of international executives, and then returned to folding linen napkins as though nothing remarkable had happened. Ethan walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Miss Whitmore." Claire looked up with the same calm smile. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell. May I ask you one more question?" "Of course." Ethan hesitated briefly. "Why have you never told anyone here that you speak French?" Claire looked around the nearly empty restaurant before answering. "Because the guests come here for an exceptional dining experience, not to hear about my resume." Ethan remained silent. Claire continued gently. "Languages are tools, Mr. Caldwell. They are useful when someone needs them. They are not decorations meant to attract attention." Ethan found himself unexpectedly humbled. During his career, he had watched executives list every achievement before introducing themselves. Claire possessed an extraordinary ability and treated it as though it were no more important than carrying a tray or refilling a coffee cup. Before he could respond, the restaurant manager called Claire to assist with closing duties. She offered Ethan a polite nod and quietly returned to work. Ethan watched her disappear into the softly lit dining room once again, realizing that the greatest mystery was no longer how she spoke flawless French. The real mystery was why someone with such remarkable talent had deliberately chosen a life where almost no one would ever discover it. And for reasons he could not yet understand, he suddenly felt compelled to find the answer. The question followed Ethan Caldwell through every meeting during the next several days. Financial forecasts, acquisition proposals, and international conference calls all demanded his attention. Yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to the quiet waitress whose greatest talent seemed to be keeping extraordinary abilities invisible. Late one afternoon, he asked his executive assistant to gather publicly available information about Claire Whitmore, expecting to discover an impressive academic career or years spent living abroad. Instead, the report seemed strangely ordinary. Claire had worked at Le Chateau Manhattan for 4 years. Before that, she had held several hospitality positions while attending college. There were no interviews, no awards, no social media celebrating multilingual achievements, and no public record suggesting an exceptional international career. Ethan closed the folder with more questions than answers. If she had spent years in France, there was almost no trace of it. If she had studied French formally, she had never used that accomplishment to advance her career. Curious rather than suspicious, Ethan returned to Le Chateau the following evening, this time without investors or business associates. He requested a quiet table near the window and asked the manager not to tell Claire he had arrived. From across the dining room, he simply watched her work. She greeted returning guests by name, remembered a retired teacher's favorite herbal tea, quietly replaced a child's dropped spoon before anyone noticed, and patiently explained menu items to visitors from out of town. Every action carried the same effortless attention she had shown during the investment dinner. She treated each person as though they deserved her full presence, regardless of their appearance or status. After nearly an hour, Ethan noticed something unexpected. An elderly French couple entered the restaurant, looking slightly uncertain as they studied the menu. Before anyone else reached them, Claire welcomed them in fluent French with a warm smile that immediately transformed their expressions. She spoke naturally, not as someone trying to demonstrate a skill, but as someone helping strangers feel at home in a foreign country. The couple laughed comfortably within moments. Claire recommended dishes from memory, explained local ingredients in elegant French, and even suggested nearby museums they might enjoy after dinner. Ethan observed every detail. She was not merely translating words. She understood customs, humor, regional expressions, and subtle cultural references that rarely appeared in language courses. After the couple finished their meal, the elderly gentleman shook Claire's hand gratefully before leaving a handwritten note beside the check. Once they departed, Ethan quietly approached the table and noticed the note had been left behind for the staff to collect. Written in French, it read, "Thank you for making New York feel like home. Kindness spoken in our own language is a gift we will never forget." Ethan folded the note carefully before asking the manager whether Claire had ever mentioned why she knew France so well. The manager smiled and shook his head. "She never talks about herself," he replied. "Whenever someone asks about her, she changes the subject and asks about them instead." Ethan stood silently for several moments, watching Claire help another family celebrate a birthday with the same genuine warmth she had shown every guest that evening. At that moment, he understood something that no resume could ever explain. Claire Whitmore had not hidden her intelligence because she lacked confidence. She had hidden it because she believed the purpose of knowledge was to serve others, not to elevate herself above them. And that quiet realization made Ethan more determined than ever to discover the story she had never chosen to tell. Several evenings later, the last dinner guests had begun leaving Le Chateau Manhattan, and the restaurant slowly settled into the peaceful rhythm that arrived after a successful service. Crystal glasses were collected, candles burned lower, and the string quartet packed away their instruments while soft jazz replaced the live performance. Claire stood quietly beside the service station organizing reservation cards for the following evening with the same careful attention she gave every task. She never noticed Ethan approaching until he stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently. She looked up and offered the same professional smile she gave every guest. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar mergers across 3 continents without hesitation, yet finding the right words in front of one quiet waitress felt unexpectedly difficult. Finally, he broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Claire listened patiently without interrupting. "When I spoke French that evening," Ethan continued, "I was not trying to communicate. I was trying to impress people at your expense. That was disrespectful, and I regret it." Claire lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "Thank you for saying that." Ethan hesitated. I have spent the last few days trying to understand something. Claire waited. Why did you never embarrass me? You could have corrected me immediately. You could have answered every careless remark I made. Instead, you waited until it became necessary. Claire folded the reservation cards neatly before answering. Because my goal was never to win an argument. Ethan remained silent. Most misunderstandings disappear when people are treated with patience, she continued softly. Humiliation usually creates another misunderstanding. Ethan studied her expression. There was no resentment hidden behind her calm voice. No satisfaction at seeing him uncomfortable. She spoke as though she were explaining something beautifully ordinary. May I ask you something more personal? He said carefully. Claire nodded. If you would rather not answer, I will understand. Go ahead. Ethan took a slow breath. How did you become so fluent? Claire smiled gently, though her eyes carried memories that reached far beyond the restaurant. My father accepted a university position in Lyon when I was a child. We lived in France for several years. French became part of daily life before it became something I studied. Ethan listened closely. Did you always intend to work in hospitality? Claire laughed quietly. No. I planned to become an interpreter specializing in international diplomacy. Ethan looked surprised, though he no longer allowed assumptions to shape his thoughts. Claire continued. Life changed after my father became seriously ill. My plans changed with it. I came home to help care for him, and eventually I realized something important. What was that? Ethan asked. Claire looked around the nearly empty dining room, where the remaining staff quietly prepared for another day. Languages can connect countries, she said. Kindness connects people. I discovered I could practice both here. Ethan looked toward the elegant restaurant with completely different eyes than he had only a week earlier. The dining room no longer seemed filled with employees performing tasks. It was filled with human beings quietly creating moments that guests would remember for years. Claire picked up a folded linen napkin and placed it carefully onto the final table before turning back toward Ethan. Knowledge becomes meaningful only after it helps someone else, she said with a warm smile. Otherwise, it is just another thing we know. Ethan realized that the greatest lesson he had received that week had never come from flawless French pronunciation or cultural expertise. It had come from a woman who understood that true intelligence never demanded attention because it naturally earned respect. The conversation lingered in Ethan Caldwell's mind long after he left Le Chateau Manhattan that evening. He had entered the restaurant believing fluency meant mastering vocabulary, pronunciation, and negotiation. He walked away realizing that Claire Whitmore possessed something far rarer. She understood that language was not a performance. It was an act of service. The following week, Ethan returned to the restaurant several times, always without announcing himself. Sometimes he arrived for breakfast before the business crowd filled the dining room. Other times he stopped by for a quiet late lunch between meetings. Each visit revealed another detail he had never noticed before. Claire greeted every guest with the same sincerity regardless of whether they wore expensive tailored suits or simple work clothes. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, dietary restrictions, favorite desserts, and even the names of grandchildren mentioned months earlier. Her remarkable memory never appeared rehearsed. It came from paying genuine attention to people. One rainy afternoon, a young couple from Quebec entered the restaurant looking slightly overwhelmed after their rental car reservation had been canceled. Claire welcomed them in fluent French, patiently explained nearby transportation options, recommended local attractions, and even wrote directions to a family-owned bookstore they hoped to visit. The couple thanked her repeatedly before leaving with relieved smiles. Ethan watched the entire exchange from across the dining room. She never looked toward him afterward. She did not seem interested in whether anyone had noticed. A few days later, Ethan invited several senior managers from Caldwell International to dinner at the restaurant. During the meal, one executive casually remarked, "Our European expansion would benefit from someone with exceptional language skills." Another immediately suggested hiring outside consultants from Paris. Ethan quietly looked toward Claire, who was helping another table celebrate a retirement with the same warm professionalism she offered everyone else. For a brief moment, he considered making her an offer on the spot. A position with an impressive salary, international travel, and opportunities most professionals would accept without hesitation. Yet he remembered her words. Knowledge becomes meaningful only after it helps someone else. He realized that approaching her with money alone would prove he still misunderstood the lesson she had given him. Instead of interrupting her work, Ethan asked the restaurant manager whether Claire might be willing to speak with him after her shift if she had time. When the evening finally ended, Claire joined him for a quiet cup of tea near the restaurant's front window where the lights of Manhattan shimmered across rain-soaked streets. Ethan looked at her with genuine respect. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, "not only for helping that evening, but for changing the way I think." Claire smiled softly. "People change only when they choose to." Ethan nodded. "You are right." After a thoughtful pause, he continued, "I would like to invite you to help my company prepare our international teams for conversations across cultures. Not because you speak French, but because you understand people." Claire remained silent for a moment before answering. "That is a generous offer." Ethan waited patiently. She looked through the rain-covered window toward the busy sidewalks outside before speaking again. "If I ever accept, it will not be because of the title or the salary." Ethan smiled. "I hoped you would say that." Claire looked back at him with quiet confidence. "It will only be because I believe the work will help people understand one another a little better than they do today." Several months passed, and the conversation that began over a quiet cup of tea continued shaping lives neither Ethan Caldwell nor Claire Whitmore had expected. Claire accepted Ethan's invitation, but only after carefully defining one condition. She would never become a symbol displayed to impress clients or investors. If she joined his international team, her role would focus on helping people communicate with greater understanding, respect, and cultural awareness. Ethan agreed without hesitation because he had finally learned the difference between showcasing talent and honoring it. The first training session took place in a simple conference room rather than a grand ballroom. Around the table sat young managers preparing for assignments across Europe, Asia, and South America. Many expected lessons about grammar, pronunciation, and negotiation strategies. Instead, Claire placed a single blank sheet of paper in front of each participant. "Before we learn another language," she said with a gentle smile, "tell me about the last time someone made you feel truly understood." The room became unexpectedly quiet. One by one, the managers shared stories about teachers, grandparents, neighbors, mentors, and strangers who had listened before speaking. Only then did Claire begin discussing communication. She explained that every language carried history, emotion, humor, and values that could never be translated word for word. Real fluency, she said, was not measured by accent alone. It was measured by whether another person felt respected after the conversation ended. Ethan sat quietly at the back of the room, listening with the same attention he had once reserved only for financial presentations. He realized that Claire was teaching something far greater than French. She was teaching people how to become better listeners, better colleagues, and better human beings. Over time, Caldwell International became known not only for successful international partnerships, but also for the unusual care its employees showed toward clients from different cultures. Business journals praised the company's remarkable relationships abroad, while employees quietly credited the woman who had once worn a black restaurant apron without anyone realizing the depth of her knowledge. Claire never asked for recognition. She continued working several evenings each week at Le Chateau Manhattan because she genuinely enjoyed welcoming guests from around the world. Whenever someone complimented her remarkable language skills, she simply smiled and changed the conversation back to them. One autumn evening, Ethan returned to the same dining table where everything had begun months earlier. The crystal chandeliers reflected softly across polished glasses while familiar music drifted through the elegant restaurant. Claire approached with the same calm smile she had always carried. This time, Ethan stood before she reached the table. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore," he said warmly. Claire smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan answered her in careful French, not to impress anyone, not to test anyone, and not to display his education. He simply thanked her for everything she had taught him. Claire listened, then replied in French with quiet kindness. "Now you are speaking the language that matters most." They both smiled before she returned to serving another table, and Ethan remained standing for a moment, watching the dining room with completely different eyes than he had on the night they first met. He no longer saw uniforms before people. He no longer assumed that titles measured wisdom. He understood that extraordinary lives often hide behind ordinary appearances, waiting not to be discovered, but simply to be respected. The greatest language in the world is not French, English, or any other spoken tongue. It is the quiet language of humility, because when respect speaks first, every heart already understands.